old friends and people that I've been in touch with over the years here with us also. So thank you very much for joining us. So it's a little bit different, this talk, than perhaps usual, I might say, because I often like to have these conversations outdoors because we're talking about hiking. We're talking about hiking the Israel Trail. And because it's 10 o'clock at night here, I'm going to be doing this indoors, but I'm happy to share with you quite a few pictures, which I hopefully will add to the experience. I want you for a second, we have to be a little bit imaginative here because we have to move out of our usual sitting in a Zoom meeting, staring at the screen. You know, we're talking here about hiking, about walking the land of Israel. So I want you to imagine standing on the edge of a cliff. This is a real story. I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and I got to a point in the trail. I'm going to ask everybody to mute yourselves because I can't see who is or isn't muted, and that would include well, everybody who's here who's logged on maybe in the last few minutes. Everybody should be muted just so we can hear. We don't have to hear external noises. So I was saying, I'm on the trail. I've got a 50-pound pack on my back. I can't. I get to a point where I'm literally at the edge of the cliff. I'm literally can't go any further. I can't turn around because my bag is going to hit the edge of the cliff, or I'm going to fall down 30 meters below to the rocks, and I basically get frozen. I'm trapped. I don't know what to do. I'm kind of panicking. So I take 3 deep breaths to calm myself down and to focus, think about the possibilities, what I can possibly do here. I turn very carefully around. I lower my pack to the ground and I retrace my steps, leaving the pack behind. I find my way back along this very narrow part of the path on this cliff's edge, on this ledge, and I find where I had missed the trail markings, where I had to go up and actually climb up the side of the cliff. So I retrace my steps, I go back, and it's really interesting. I put the pack back on, but this 50-pound pack felt somehow lighter, which was a strange thing. But the only explanation really can be is that nothing on the pack had changed, but I had changed. My attitude had changed. My sense of where I'm going, where the path is, what my goal is almost had changed. And so at this point, I was able to move ahead with the hike, as it were. For me, that's almost, well, it is a very good example of what we'll be talking about today. In 2014, February, I set out to hike the Israel National Trail, Shvil Yisrael, as it's called in Hebrew. 700 miles long, as you can see, from the tip of the country in the south and Eilat up to the border of Lebanon in the north. 700 miles. I walked 2 months all alone with a 50-pound pack on my back, as I mentioned. That's something of a challenge, as you can imagine, for a casual hiker. Normally, in this part of the world, the normal cohort who hike the trail are really the 21-year-old crowd, not the 51-year-old crowd. But I did it for a very specific reason, which I'll describe shortly. It was 8 weeks of about 12 to 15 miles a day, and alone with my thoughts, I have to say I experienced a real transformation, a rather unique perspective on the history and people and vistas and nature of the Holy Land. And what I haven't mentioned yet, but which is really the kind of the pivotal aspect of my hike, was I was looking to heal. It was just a few weeks after I had finalized what was for me a devastating divorce, a divorce that I hadn't looked for, which turned my life upside down. I was angry and I was frustrated. I was full of resentment, mostly sad and in pain. Well, I basically spent those 8 weeks, one friend called it one long meditation. I meditated on mountaintops. I cried in dry creek beds. I wrote anguished journal entries, composed songs to lift my spirits. I looked back and inward and up to the night sky and over the valley to the next mountain range and down at the ants and the dirt and back along the trail to see how far I'd come. What I discovered on the Shvil was a sense of self, a sense of personal and national history with a perspective of sorts on the human condition. In my search for peace, I can share with you that while I was walking the land of Israel, I realized that many of the lessons that I was learning really helped me. Lessons that I learned in the physical journey of the hike, I realized could perhaps be helpful to others. And I came to understand that there are 5 critical or basic or fundamental elements which combine for me to create a framework of real inner peace. I mean, the truth is it could be national, international peace too, but for me it was a personal issue of reaching a sense of peace and harmony inside myself. I mean, the truth is what I learned isn't particularly new or mysterious, but together it formed a basis for my personal healing and my ability to move ahead with my life. The truth is that combining these 5 elements on the trail, hiking, really helped immeasurably. And a life philosophy based on these 5 elements can lead really, I would say, very immeasurably, can lead to incredible happiness, the kind that we all yearn for. And to be honest, that is the subject, well, the main subject of my book. It's not a hiking kind of travelogue. The book itself, called My Israel Trail, Finding Peace in the Promised Land, is about that inner peace. And what I'd like to share with you today are some details and anecdotes related to those 5 lessons that I learned while hiking or trudging through the land of milk and honey. So I'm kind of inviting you to join me as I review those 5 elements of the lessons I learned while hiking. And I'm happy to get started. Here in the, I've learned something new with how we can work with PowerPoint and Zoom. I can zoom into that part of the map which we're focused on now, which is the Eilat Mountains and the southern parts of the Negev. I am kind of have to start by going back to that cliff experience, because I shared with you that loosening or lessening of the weight that I felt from my pack. And I think that may be a perfect metaphor, that sometimes when we reach an impasse and the next step is unclear, we're not sure how we got there, we're kind of too scared to move like I was on the side of that cliff. It's really difficult because the alternatives that we could imagine are dangerous or frightening or unpalatable. And sometimes it seems to me, in any case, what I did there physically on the trail, putting down my backpack in order to retrace my steps and kind of reevaluate what my possibilities were, that's just a metaphor. It became a metaphor for me that in times of personal hardship and challenges, which test our mettle, we sometimes have to put down our baggage and reevaluate. And the truth is, there are others, great others before me, that have dealt with these issues, from our sages in the Gemara to Elie Wiesel and Viktor Frankl, who took the personal and national horror of the Holocaust, the Shoah, and translated his experiences into really timeless lessons, I think, for humanity. He talks there about having a goal. In man's search for meaning, it's all about having a goal. And for me, the goal of a particular day to get to that night camp, or my overall goal to finish the Shvil, to hike the almost 1,000 kilometers, 700 miles of the Israel Trail, and my goal of healing from my painful divorce, getting my life back on track, or finding a new track. And that was very, very much part of my understanding that I reached while hiking. Sometimes we just have to set aside our baggage and reevaluate. And the truth is, that's what the trail did for me. It was kind of the discovery or rediscovery of a number of essential truths for living. And these are from the Torah, from the Hebrew Bible, from Jewish tradition. But they're universal and they're relevant for any real seekers of truth. I was overwhelmed by the challenges, the trail itself, but of life, and even some of our national issues that we were going through at the time. Every day on the trail, the heat, the inclines, the descents, loneliness, crises of confidence, family news that I got, news of terror attacks, what have you. It was a very difficult time. And what I learned by hiking the trail was something, a number of lessons that I'm very happy to share with you. The first and I think the basic one, I think you can feel for a second with me. I'm going to play this video, and I hope that you can feel with me a sense of what it means to wander through the desert alone for hours and hours, or even days and days, which was the beginning of my hike on the Israel Trail. I guess I go that way. So I'm purposefully not talking over the sounds there of me breathing and what is basically the wind and otherwise the silence in the desert. I hope you had a feeling, even though you're sitting there in front of your computer, as am I. Every time I see this, I kind of relive this silence, this vastness of being in the desert. And you know, all of you are pretty familiar with Israel. Many of you are. Most of you probably have visited. Israel's not that big a country. It's not like America or, you know, the Mojave Desert in the south of California. It's not like there's that much room. We don't think of it as a vast expanse of space or lands. And yet you can walk for days without seeing a single soul when you're in the Negev Desert, which I did. And I hope that gave you a little bit of a feel for at least a taste of what it's like walking there in the desert. For me, it generated in me a great sense of humility. I was literally disappearing from the world. I mean, I really felt like I was insignificant, virtually irrelevant. I had left my family. My kids didn't need me. My work didn't need me. My former wife obviously didn't need me. And I really felt that I was just humbled by the experience of walking in the desert and feeling such a small bit of such a large universe. It gave me perspective. And I don't mean, it's not belittling our pain or our problems, but it seems to me that it makes them more manageable, reduces the intensity. It gave me at least the feeling that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. And for me, that desert experience was a crucial first step in my beginning the first movement towards a real healing. And I will say that it was an important basis for everything that was to come afterwards. Now, I'd like to tell a story about hiking up a very, very steep ascent on Mount Solomon, Har Shlomo, which I'll relate to you in brief. I describe it in detail in my book, and it's one of the more humorous and yet one of the more difficult aspects of the trip for me. But one of the important lessons, which was basically the second lesson that I want to share with you. I was hiking up this very steep hill, and I really was not sure what I was doing. And it was a physical challenge that I really hadn't expected, literally hand over hand climbing up boulders that were bigger than myself. And I asked myself, what have I done? What am I doing here? I didn't sign up for some physical challenge to prove anything to anybody. And I literally at one point took out my phone. I was going to turn the phone on and call my son and have him call the emergency services, the 669 Air Force Rescue Unit, to come and take me off the side of this mountain. And eventually, I took myself in hand and I said to myself, look, you're here. This is where you are. And being where you are, you don't have anybody else to turn to. you're responsible for what happens next. You have to accept the fact that you made this decision to climb up this mountain. And in accepting it, I basically got to the point of recognizing that I could focus on what I need to do next and even almost enjoy the experience. In other words, even if I made a bad decision, I wanted to accept it. Accepting the idea that you can't change necessarily. There's a pithy aphorism that says that asks for the wisdom to know the difference between those things I can change and those I can't. And really, for me, that was the second lesson, an acceptance of what I'm doing, where I am, the decisions I've made, and ability to move on after that. And that basically, that second lesson accompanied me as I moved into the second stage of the trip here in the middle of the Negev, what's called the central Negev, which included one of the hardest days on the trip, without question. Before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit more about acceptance and to share with you another experience of the desert silence that hopefully, even on your computer screen, you can get a little bit of a taste, a feel of what it was like. Basically, this issue of acceptance was one for me, which that night I wrote in my journal. It wasn't applicable only to the hike itself and the lessons to learn on the hike. It was applicable, and importantly so, for the situation that I had found myself in terms of being divorced. And being divorced, which was not a situation that I had expected to find myself in, was one which I simply had to accept. This is my reality. This is your reality, and you need to accept that you're going to have to live with this and make good decisions to be able to move on from that. So another kind of example of that acceptance occurred here at the top of this, the top of this hill that you can see in front of you. Another cliff. There were a lot of cliffs on this trip. Here we are at the top of the cliff, right outside of Hod Akev, outside of Sde Boker in the central Negev. And I'm going to let this video speak for itself as I hovered at the edge of this cliff, just reminding you that I had a 50-pound pack on my back, and I'm 51 years old, not 21. I'm calling your attention before we start, if you can see where my pointer is, to the very small dots there at the bottom of this hill. So, I took a photo of this. I don't know if you can see it on the shade. Assuming you can. This, I'm supposed to do the 24-kilo pack. I don't think so. It's just not going to happen. See those two guys down there? I'm just going to zoom in with this. There's two guys down there. And I asked them when they were about over here on the cliffside, and they were sliding down that part on their bottom, and they have no teak, no tarmil. I said, is this going to be possible, the 24-kilo pack? So the answer was, No, not going to be possible with a 24 kilo, a 50-pound pack on my back. And I literally walked for 4 hours all around the entire mountain to find my way to the bottom of that trail in order to reach the night camp. That, for me, was another lesson of acceptance. You have to accept where you are and deal with where you are at that time, not end up full of recriminations, not blame others, but to actually be able to deal with where you are, whatever you're doing, however hard it is. Like here you see a picture of something called the Carbolit, which is the hardest day on the trail, which was actually the next day after, 2 days after the video that I just shared with you, where you're literally walking along a knife's edge with the winds blowing you or seeming to threaten to blow you right off the cliff. And that was the hardest day of the hike. And I remember asking myself, what am I doing here? And that acknowledgement of the reality was almost a cathartic, a liberating feeling. And so it was that kind of acceptance which made me able, I think, to move ahead with my own personal challenge outside of the trail itself, because I was able to translate that lesson on the top of the Carbolit and the top of Har Shlomo to the experience I was having in my life outside the trail. I remember reading something about Michael Fox. Michael Fox, who faced his own challenges, as you probably know. He wrote once, and I have the quote here somewhere. He wrote, "Acceptance doesn't mean resignation. It means understanding that something is what it is and that there's got to be a way through it." And that really speaks to me, and it spoke to me. It's not that we can't or shouldn't work to change our reality or ourselves for that matter, but it's just the first step in mapping out our path towards that change. We're at the top of the Carbolit again. I thought you might enjoy it.
Shame I couldn't film them prancing away.
A little bit of the wildlife. This issue of acknowledging that there are aspects of our life over which we have no control is really, that's the most important part to me about that pithy aphorism, about accepting the things I cannot change and having the wisdom to know the difference. The truth is, it could have been frightening, and this combination of the humility, acknowledging how small and insignificant we are in the vast universe in the course of history, and also this acceptance of the reality that I was facing. But it's really liberating, invigorating even, this ability to just accept life as it is with a sense of humility. So that brings me to my third lesson, the third lesson that I learned from the hike and the trail, which does have a religious component to it, which I can share with you afterwards if you like. I don't want to go on too long, waxing too philosophical, but I guess I've always been a person who was kind of a grateful sort of person, and the trail enhanced or reinforced or reaffirmed a really deep sense of appreciation and gratitude for virtually everything. I mean, a sunset, a bird song, a beautiful view were part and parcel of every day of the trail. And I was extremely grateful for my family, for my health, for the opportunity that I had to walk the land of Israel, even in the midst of my pain. I mean, it's kind of a funny and strange thing to say, the gratitude that I had for this opportunity, which literally came about because of a real personal situation of suffering. Sometimes I even cried in thanks for a simple thing, like the first flower, this one, which I took a photo of, that I had seen in the desert after so many days and days of walking in the brown or light brown or yellow, gold, sometimes black rocks and sand or what have you. But that gratitude extended even beyond that. On the trail, there were trail angels, which is something I'd like to tell you about, because I was really grateful, truly grateful for the people that I met and for the friends that supported me and the hosts that I was privileged to stay with when I was hiking the trail. Trail angels are something. Ask me at the end if you'd like. I can give a bit more detail. But they're people who open up their homes, like Aryeh and Leah Schiff, whose backyard here, as you see in the picture, they turned into kind of a Bedouin encampment with an outside toilet in memory of their son Ofer, who was unfortunately killed in a tragic car accident. But this institution is unique in Israel and for the Israel Trail. There's no such thing, not in the Pacific Crest Trail or the Appalachian Trail or in Nepal or Machu Picchu or what have you, where people open up their homes to absolute strangers and give a bed and give a shower and sheets sometimes and pillows, towels, but also food and resupply and what have you. And that gratitude is something that accompanied me in that, especially in the third week of the trail, where I was in the northern Negev, in the Judean desert, because that was the first time actually that I had stayed with some trail angels. I want to stop for a second with this desert experience in the Judean desert to share with you what was really one of the most transformative days and parts of my experience. I would ask you, although you're all on mute, but I've asked many groups in different talks over the years, what is Israel's largest nature reserve? And people come up with all sorts of interesting answers, most of them more well known to those people who've traveled to Israel or involved with the JNF or what have you. Nobody ever guesses the Judean Desert Nature Reserve. Why do you think that is? Sandra, I don't know if that's you, but I think I need to ask you to mute your microphone, or anybody else who's not muted. This picture you're looking at of the Judean desert shows one of the most tremendous aspects of that particular desert. But it's an interesting thing. It's called a nature reserve, but there's no nature there. There's virtually no life. I mean, there's no bushes, there's no trees, there were no birds, there were no ants or beetles even on the ground. For me, it was not as stark as you might think. It was incredibly uplifting. It was probably the most transformative, as I said, day that I had on the trail. And that's because there was nothing there. There was nothing to distract me from my thoughts. And the thoughts that I had as I was walking through this Judean Desert Nature Reserve were just connection on the one hand to the universe and God and the world and the planet, and also to our people, because I was literally walking the footsteps of our prophets. This Judean desert is where our prophets came, where King David fled when he was fleeing King Saul. This connection that I had to this idea of walking in the footsteps of our ancestors while I was contemplating life and the universe and everything, enabled me to combine these first three initial elements that I had learned, these first three lessons of humility and acceptance and gratitude, into a framework that was really indispensable for me to reach the healing that I could in terms of my own personal growth. I did some really interesting meditative practices based on our Jewish tradition, from the prayer of Modeh Ani to an understanding of the name of God, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which is loosely translated, I will be as I will be what I will be. Talk about acceptance, talk about a humble acceptance of what is, that the first name of God that he revealed himself to Moses, to Moshe Rabbeinu in the desert, was this kind of declaration that what is, and you have to accept that. So this idea that God controls the world and not me was very much a part of combining the humility and the acceptance into also then with our Jewish tradition, this modeh ani, this gratitude of I am thankful, as we say, the traditional Jewish prayer that we say on waking. I'd often sing it actually as I was walking through the morning couple of hours, especially in the desert. And it really, singing that at the top of my voice was a really interesting way to make the transition from the humility to acceptance to a real sense of appreciation, gratitude, just expressing my incredible, deep appreciation for everything good that was in my life. And I was grateful, which I mentioned, the privilege that I had to hike the trail, but also everything else that I've been privileged to enjoy in my life, including my family and counterintuitively, as I said, my marriage. It was a really important step on the path to healing. I found in any case, it made the coping with the suffering and moving beyond the suffering possible. And I'm sharing with you a video here of as I came, if that emotional transition from humility and acceptance to gratitude, it was also accompanied by a geographical transition from the desert of the Negev into, as you can see, a more forested kind of environment in the northern Negev as I actually neared the center of the country. I thought you might like to walk with me through the Yatir forest just at the northern tip of the Negev. So now we're getting near to home. And here we end up coming to an area that I'm very, very familiar with. And not only that, it's the land of our forefathers. This is our ancestral homeland that we're talking about. Hebron, the hills of Hebron, the hills of Jerusalem. And for me, it was a question of navigating literally around my home. My home in Beit Shemesh here in the center, I literally spent a week circumnavigating around my home. So talk about a sense of appreciation, of gratitude. On the one hand, this is our ancestral homeland. This, Hebron, Yerushalayim, Beit Shemesh, Tel Azekah, Lachish, these are areas which are full of archaeological remains and historical elements that most of us are very familiar with, of Samson, Delilah, and more than that, of King David and before he was the king, David and Goliath, and of course Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and what have you. I was incredibly grateful for the ability that I was given, the privilege I was given to walk through this land. And of course, because I was so near home, I ended up spending a lot of time walking every day and ruminating on the gratitude that I had to my family, whether it was for my daughter's walking sticks, my daughter-in-law's walking sticks, or the help that I'd received from family and friends. And the truth is, and I've referred to this once or twice already, also a sense of gratitude to my former wife. And in this sense, not so much for the opportunity to hike the land of Israel, but for the wonderful and fulfilling life that we had shared, building what basically in Hebrew we call a Bayit Ne'eman Yisrael. It's kind of a funny way of translating it, but a faith-filled home in Israel. And I was very, very grateful for that as I walked through the areas where I had spent the previous 25 years here in the Beit Shemesh region, biking and hiking, and were so familiar to me. And the truth is, by having that gratitude, it made the hike itself and the difficulties of the hike more bearable. And of course, it was a very important thing to lead me towards the recovery that I was working towards, which for the record, I hadn't really anticipated. I took the hike to kind of get out and get away and clear my head, as it were, as one person said to me in the midst of the trail. But these lessons that I was learning along the way from the physical hike, without question, were a welcome benefit and boon to the choice that I had made to take the hike. It reminds me also of, I have here another quote from Lao Tzu, which I like to use because it kind of sums up what I've been trying to say. Lao Tzu wrote, obviously centuries ago, "Be content with what you have. Rejoice in the way things are. When you realize there is nothing lacking, then the whole world belongs to you. From wonder into wonder, existence opens." For me, that wonder, that amazement at whether it's a breathtaking view or the gratitude that I had for friends and family, or the privilege of living here in Israel in this miraculous era of our return to sovereignty in our ancestral homeland, that all was very, very much a part of this week on the trail, because I was so near my hometown. And in fact, this picture reflects something kind of historically ironic. You could see, I think, in my expression, a bit of an ironic smile. I'm standing in front of something that's known as the Roman Road. These are steps in the mountainous region leading up to Jerusalem, where the Romans built for themselves steps to enable them to bring their mules and their material and their war machines up to Jerusalem for the siege of Jerusalem. And they built these in order to enable them to be successful. And they were successful. And yet, my smirk, as it were, seems to suggest, like Mark Twain said in one of his great statements about the Romans and others who rose up and made a loud noise, but they're no longer here. And we're here. And I'm here, hiking this road. And happily so as well. I'm actually skipping through a few slides of meeting up with family who were friends and who are my trail angels. And I'll skip a story of how cold it was one night and my daughter didn't let me come home, which kind of was an irony of being a little bit older as a trail hiker. I spent that Shabbat in a forest right near my house, and I don't think I mentioned, but I circumnavigated Beit Shemesh, my hometown, but I didn't set foot at home. And that was kind of weird in and of itself. I spent a lovely Shabbat in a forest nearby, and then it was Purim. And I had friends who came and read with me the Megillah and celebrated Purim on the Motzei Shabbat and the Sunday. And then I did something a little bit unusual, which leads us to our next lesson. And that is that I jumped up on the Sunday to the north. Instead of continuing to hike in a northern direction, having come from Eilat up to the center of the country around Beit Shemesh, I jumped up to the north, to the very tip of the country there on the border with Lebanon, in order to start to make my way down. I did so partially because the red guide to hikers on the trail suggested that that was a good idea in order to not miss the flowering, the blossoms of the early spring up there. But I also did it because it meant that I could then hike in a southerly direction and end up back there in the center of the country and actually walk home, which I did. Well, jumping up to the north started me on another element of my story. The next lesson that I learned is probably the hardest for me, or was the hardest for me on the trail, and the hardest for me in getting over my divorce, because the lesson was a lesson in forgiveness. And you can imagine that this gratitude that I was describing for my 28-year marriage wasn't easy to achieve, marred as it was by my wife's leaving. But the truth is that realizing my own inconsequentiality, if you will, this issue of humility, and accepting the reality that I was facing, and pushing myself to remember and appreciate all the wonderful aspects of the life that we had built together, and actually really feeling the gratitude that I did have for the life that we had built together. That was a really crucial part of the process enabling me to reach this fourth element that I want to share with you, which is forgiveness. I do want to say, just as background, we had a very happy marriage. My wife experienced a sudden storm which tossed and overturned basically the ship of our marriage and our life, and it was unexpected. It was a shock to all of us and to all of our family, our friends. I supported her right to choose, and I wanted her to be happy. But it was definitely not your normal story of a couple who couldn't get along or needed to divorce. I have nothing, obviously, against divorce as a part of life, but our story was unusual because it came literally out of nowhere. In fact, at giving my former wife the divorce agreement in the Rabbanut, I said to her, "This is the greatest act of love that I can do, because I do love you and I want to make you happy. And if this is what's going to make you happy, then that is the greatest act of love that I can do for you." And so I did that. But of course, I was devastated. And I think I'm sharing that with you only because it's an important element of understanding, in our world, 50% of marriages end in divorce. So why is this guy, why did he take the hike, and why is he talking about how devastating it was? But the specific elements of our story, I think, in sharing those with you, can help to understand where this all comes from and why it was important. But I want to skip over one element of the kind of introduction to this topic, because there are a lot of things that you might imagine that are intuitive about what I've said so far in terms of the hike itself. Forgiveness isn't something you would normally associate necessarily with a hike or a trek, but there are actually many things and people and situations which you can complain about when you're doing this kind of an extended trek. I've mentioned, I think, the heat and certainly the steep inclines, and I spent a lot of time working to forgive myself for this decision to take this crazy hike, a few times a day probably. And the guy who wrote that red guide that I mentioned, the author of the red guide, I had to probably 2-3 times a week, I had to work on my sense of forgiveness, to forgive him for all sorts of suggestions he made or instructions that he gave that were problematic, let's say, or not necessarily justified. My anger at the guide, or at the author of the guide, and other small challenges or inconveniences on the trail, they got in my way, and they diminished my enjoyment of the trail. But all the more so, obviously, the anger and resentment that I felt towards my former wife and the way she left me, and at God for allowing all this pain and suffering to happen. And admittedly to myself also, for the mistakes that I made, even without knowing, in my life, in our relationship, what have you. And all this really did get in the way of my healing and ability to move on with my life, and to enjoy my life. And so this issue of forgiveness clearly was a difficult thing for me. Although in my mind, intellectually, I had forgiven her for making her decision. As I said, she had that right. She was an adult, and I agreed to the divorce. But something happened to me in this stream that you're looking at the picture of now, which was pivotal in my being able to reach a much more deep sense of forgiveness. And that was basically jumping into this water where I had spent family holidays with my wife, with our 3 children, a number of different times, frolicking in the water that you can see here as it slowly flows by. It was very painful for me to be on this part of the trail. And I decided then and there that I had to jump in the water. And I did. And in jumping in the water, it was almost like a mikveh experience. You may be familiar with the term mayim chayim, the living waters of the mikveh. And as a natural body of water, the stream was actually a mikveh. And it takes me much longer to describe the story than it actually happened. But when I jumped in the water, I felt this swell of emotion. I started to cry, and therefore the water was mixed with my tears. You may have noticed I've mentioned crying once or twice. I'm one of those kind of men that cry easily and I'm not embarrassed about it. But when I came up out of the water, I experienced this almost sense of jubilation, this exhilaration, this almost joy or happiness, because I realized in that moment, with the emotions of realizing that we would never be here again as a family, the coolness of the water, maybe the mikveh-like experience, whatever it was, like a rebirth, made me realize that I truly, deeply forgave her for the decision she had taken, for breaking up our family. And that for me was a second or third transformative part of the trail. Because from then on, the weight of the anger and the resentment that I had carried with me for a number of years as we led up to the divorce, and of course for the 4.5 weeks until I got to that point of the trail, had weighed me down, just like that baggage we talked about at the beginning. There's no question, allowing ourselves to forgive others who've caused us pain or whom we feel have hurt us, whether personally or even or communally, even nationally, it's an essential part of moving ahead with our lives. And I think, and developing cooperative and harmonious relationships and feeling good about ourselves. I remember in college learning from Leo Buscaglia, who taught an iconic class which is called Love at USC for many years, learning in some of my courses at UC Berkeley, where I studied psychology. Reading his books, he stresses the importance of forgiving for our own personal growth and personal welfare. He actually talks about forgiving our parents, which I'm happy to mention here, since my parents are actually joining us on this Zoom call. Leo Buscaglia talks about forgiving our parents, for instance, for their very humanness. He passionately advocates moving on and exploring all the alternative paths available to us in any situation, as Gandhi did actually before him. I'm not saying that it's important to forgive and forget. I think to a certain extent, I'm saying that we need to forgive and remember, that we need to remember and acknowledge the hurt or the pain, but to forgive and put behind us whatever historical grievances that we have, whatever baggage that we're carrying, as it were. I mean, in fact, the truth is, my next book is going to focus a lot on this issue, on the international sphere, in terms of coming to a different view of how we can bring peace between Arabs and Jews, which is based a lot on the issue of forgiveness. But suffice to say, there were a few incidents on the trail, not just there at Nachal Snir, at that body, that little creek on the border, where I came to an understanding of the importance of forgiveness within the context not only of my life and my relationship, but also in our international relationship, especially with the Arab world. This is just a little break, because it's been very intensive now for the last 40 minutes or so. And we're nearing the end of the tale and the end of my journey, and I'm happy to take your questions and to elaborate on more details if you'd like when we're finished. But this is kind of a little break in the telling of the tale, where I stopped for breakfast one day up in the Galil. I want to relate to you some of the aspects of the hike which I haven't really focused on yet. I mentioned the issue of walking in the footsteps of our ancestors, and there are times where you really can appreciate the difference between hiking the Israel National Trail and the others that I mentioned, like Machu Picchu or the Appalachian Trail, or where you are, of course, in the Pacific Crest Trail. In the midst of this forest, just over the hill that you can see in the distance, I stumbled upon a grave which didn't even have a road to it, no visiting amenities in terms of a snack shop or a parking lot or what have you. And I was curious to see, because it said on the side of the tomb, this was the tomb of Eliyahu ben Amotz. And that didn't mean anything to me. And so I looked it up, and it turns out that was the tomb of Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah, the prophet. Yes, that one, the swords and plowshares one that everybody knows. In the middle of a forest, under a grove of trees, virtually unnoticeable. And yet, there was something so natural about it. Hiking through the Galilee and stumbling on the grave of one of the greatest prophets of Israel, one of the philosophical and religious and spiritual lights for humanity, casually, is just such a great example of what it means to be hiking the Israel Trail as a Jew. And the truth is, even as a non-Jew, but somebody who appreciates the Hebrew Bible and the historical connection that we have to our ancestral homeland. And by the way, just as an aside, the historicity, whether or not it's true or not, that this is the grave of Eliyahu, of Elijah, wasn't important to me at the time. Apparently, there's some dispute between archaeologists and historians. His grave may be actually there in Jerusalem. But for me, it was just an incredible example of the connection that we have to our land, and within the context of our return to our ancestral homeland. That was true for me in many ways. This is a gat. This is a wine press, an ancient wine press on the side of the trail. I make wine as a hobby, and for me, that was a connection that I made again and again hiking the land of Israel. Because I would come across these small little wine presses almost everywhere. And here you can see me getting ready for Shabbat in the hills of Meron across from Tzfat, the holy city of Safed, of Tzfat. And that was another phenomenal and uplifting element of the trail, of the multifaceted people, the unity among the diversity that there was and that there is in Israel. In the various different places that I visited. And here we end up moving south towards going from the Galilee to the coast, where my story begins to come to an end. You remember that cliff from the beginning of our story 40 minutes ago? Well, that was the cliff that I walked along. This was the trail that I mentioned that I got to the end to and didn't know what to do. And here are the handholds that I found that the path goes up the side of the hill. And that's where I had that terrific lesson on putting down our baggage and being able to move forward with a lighter feeling of when you know where the path is. I have to say that in the Galil, my thoughts went very much to these issues of acceptance on a national level, the multi-ethnic nature of Israel. Here you can see a trail sign under a mosque in a small Arab village, and this issue of acceptance and forgiveness and gratitude and a little humility that could be brought to bear in our efforts to bring peace between Arabs and Jews. Very, very important theme within the context of this last week and a half of the trail as I neared the end of it. And then I was basically going home. Although I don't live on the ocean, the sea has always been for me, as somebody who grew up in California, an emotional home type of a feeling. And when I crested the Carmel mountain range and saw the sea as I did here for the first time, I burst into tears. I can't explain why. Feeling of going home. I think that's the only way I can describe it. And in fact, I'm going to share with you the exhilaration of actually arriving there at the sea as I... It's windy. What I didn't record here was my whooping, my yelling, my feeling the endless possibilities of looking at the sea and understanding that as I was nearing the end of my trip, that that I had not just achieved what I had set out to achieve, to hike the trail, but that actually I wasn't just going home, but that I was looking at a future that was stronger and brighter than I even would have imagined from the outset, having started the hike. And basically that brings us towards the end. I was heading home. I was on my way now down the coast, then moving inland, and yet I still had the question. Having forgiven, being full of gratitude, looking towards the future, accepting the situation I found myself in, and open to the various possibilities that I was thinking of where to go next. Those possibilities had to be anchored in some sort of overriding principles, some goals or principles that would lead to a goal, or goals that would make my life worth living. I mean, I said at the very beginning, I always had this physical goal to climb to the top of a specific mountain or to reach the destination that was planned for that day. To finish the trail itself obviously was a goal, but obviously I was also, following my divorce, I had new goals to set to get my life back on track. Different personal aspirations related to family, community, professional, career moves, and the like. I mean, but on a general level also, I recognized that while I was on the trail, I had rediscovered, as it were, the spiritual and national human goals that I've pursued since being a young adult. I don't think it was a coincidence that I found walking the land of Israel immensely uplifting, because it combined so many of my personal values in one activity. I was walking in nature in the land of my people, where our prophets and forefathers lived, worked, fought, and died, and where they introduced the ethical monotheism of Jewish thought and tradition to the world. And all of this at a time of reestablished independence here. As I mentioned, it was kind of, as one friend suggested, one long walking meditation. I combined my love of the outdoors with a deep emotional identification with the Zionist enterprise, and a powerful aim to enhance and improve my spiritual and religious practices and commitment. Without question, I was able to recommit to this sense of a personal and national sense of meaning, mission, meaning, like Viktor Frankl talked about. Giving our life meaning by having goals, having a sense of purpose. And all of that enveloped in this, just being part of this return to Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel after 2,000 years of dispersion. And so the truth is, as I made my way down the coast to Tel Aviv, I was thinking of Viktor Frankl and all of the things that he talked about and wrote about being active and being in relationships and working on our personal growth. What I ended up calling doing and loving and being. So I'm happy to share with you that kind of my feeling in that last week. I started waxing poetic about all of us and all of us facing our personal challenges, whatever they might be, whether it's divorce or God forbid, death, or losing a job, or all the challenges that we all face. That these three things that Viktor Frankl talked about so eloquently, about doing, acting, and loving, and just being, our personal growth, that's what makes life worth living. And it takes effort, conscious effort and focus to establish and then pursue whatever our goals are. And I'm stopping for a second to ask you to mute your phone or your computer if you can. Somebody's, okay. I was saying just that it takes an effort, and I think we all know that, to achieve these kind of goals. But without goals, I mean, the truth is, whatever humility and acceptance and gratitude and forgiveness that we do develop, they're worth less in the end if we don't have some sense of goals. So as I made my way from Tel Aviv along the Yarkon River that you can see here, a beautiful little oasis right in the middle of metropolitan Tel Aviv, kind of like Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, if you will. As I made my way along the Yarkon, from Tel Aviv moving inland, I was thinking all the time about different goals I want to set for myself, ramping up my activities to help promote the legitimacy of Israel, working with my friend Yosef Abramowitz, promoting renewable energy in Africa, personal goals about setting up my winery. I mentioned I made wine as a hobby. Personal goals about being an even better father and more active father and grandfather, and goals related to my expression of my faith and my spiritual health. And then one day I saw two pigeons, two doves, turtle doves, land on this piece of wood with the sign of the trail on it, and flittering around as doves do. I thought for a second to myself, doves mate for life, don't they? That's kind of an urban legend. I looked it up later. It happens to be true. And I had this kind of thought, this fleeting thought, well, doves could mate for life. How come we couldn't make our marriage last? And that could have been, obviously, a time of melancholy. That could have been depressing. But it wasn't. It wasn't. I actually looked at them and had that fleeting thought and thought, you know what? I think I am now at the point that I can be open to love. I think that I can see that possibly happening. I don't know what will happen, but I'm certainly ready to look for a new relationship, to look for a new partner and soulmate. And I developed a kind of a confidence there towards the end of the trail that I thought maybe I would be able to include that in my sense of goals and purpose, the idea of loving again. And that's where I found myself the day before the end of the trail at this marker telling me the green arrow to leave the trail, because here the marker is saying that the trail goes left, but I need to go right. I need to go to a place that I could gather my thoughts last night before the trail, and really take stock of what I'd learned. What I'd learned, I would say, just to end our time together, at base, taking to heart an individual with a humble sense of purpose, I think has a greater motivation to forgive, more to appreciate, more reasons to be grateful, and an enhanced incentive to accept historical and present reality, because we just want to move on with our lives, to achieve our goals, whatever our goals are. And it was true for me on the Shvil, on the trail. It has been true for me in my life. I think it can be true for others who are seeking solace and direction. It also, I would say, could be true, not just for facing personal challenges, but international challenges. I mentioned in passing, that's what my next book is going to be about, applying these lessons to the Arab-Israel conflict, and with a little bit of humility, trying to see if we can find a place for forgiveness and gratitude, and set goals for ourselves as societies here in the Middle East to enable us to reach a real reconciliation and real peace in the region. But anyway, that gets kind of ahead of ourselves. The reason I wrote my first book, My Israel Trail, was to describe these experiences that I shared with you on the Shvil and how they helped me face my personal challenges. And I've been persuaded now by so many others who I've shared these with that they really can help others facing their personal challenges. So that basically is our story, our shared Israel trail, as it were. The story of our people as the Jewish nation, our connection to our ancestral homeland, and that's kind of one of the reasons that I wrote the book, aside from the personal growth stories. But that basically brings us to the end of our time together, and my telling of my story and my journey. Here you can see me arriving home, and I want to just as an end share with you the actual day and time of my arrival, when some of my kids walked with me, and we walked home. My son, this is my daughter-in-law, and she and my son accompanied me as we arrived home.
Hey, from Maria. Hey, she's coming. Hey, no, wait, I'm coming around, wait. Dad, you have to run through, wait.
And he falls and breaks his leg.
Woohoo! It's video.
That gives you a little bit of a feel for what it was like arriving home. And I'll just share with you in a few seconds kind of what happened after the Shvil, after the trail. I basically quit my job. I pursued these new goals, some of which I had shared with you just now. And I did, in fact, find new love. My wonderful, caring, wise, patient, loving, beautiful, understanding wife, Miriam. We've been married now for 5 years since we basically were married a year and a half after I finished the hike. And I certainly have found a certain sense of inner peace. I wrote the book. I've been working on opening my winery, but I've been working with my friend Yosef to bring renewable energy to Africa. And so a lot of the goals that I had set for myself, I'm in the midst of achieving. And through my experiences on the Shvil, physically and in the process of this kind of inner and outer exploration that I've shared with you in this last hour or so, and the personal growth that I experienced, both during and after the trek, I honestly discovered a path which I'm confident can be of some help to others facing similar challenges. It's basically based on time-honored wisdom and the works of giants. It's not that I invented or brought up anything new, from Talmudic sages to modern psychologists and teachers and writers. I think that just the last thing I could say is that, yeah, sometimes we have to set aside our baggage and reevaluate where we are and bring some sense of humility and acceptance and gratitude, forgiveness and purpose into our lives. They certainly found a home in me. I mean, you don't have to hike 700 miles in 8 weeks with a 50-pound pack on your back all alone in order to reach these conclusions. But any case, if you're interested in hiking the trail, I would say I would be delighted if you would come and do so, and happy to help you with any suggestions you might want. But next time you come to Israel, as COVID-19 hopefully leaves us at some point soon, to come and come to Israel, the least that I would love is if you'd look me up. We can share a glass of my homemade wine on my balcony as we watch the sunset and talk about the trail, even if you don't end up hiking the trail. But thank you for joining me this evening or this afternoon for you. I'm happy to answer any questions if you'd like.
Yes, thank you very much, Aryeh. Thank you very much for sharing with us your trail adventures. And I think some people have some questions. And please let us know also how can people purchase your book, which is the first book or the second one that you haven't started writing yet. I guess it's not available yet, but the first book would be very, very interesting. Thank you. Let's unmute ourselves, all of us, and anybody who has any questions, please feel free to ask Aryeh.
Baruch.
You go ahead first, Talia. You go ahead.
No, I'm just giving you the honors.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Aryeh. It was very inspiring. I really enjoyed it very much. I have seen cities of Israel all over, but not the way that, I mean, outside desert and all that. It's incredible. I have
Thank you.
a question. I know you might agree with me or everyone that Israel is the only place on the earth that is always tied to heavens. To heavens. It is
okay.
Heaven and earth are the same for us. When you were in the desert at night, when you were sleeping, Of course, it was tent outside. What did you see in the sky? What did you see in the way of stars? Can you share that information?
Sure, of course. In the Negev desert for the first 3 weeks, and also in the Galil, obviously in the areas that were less built up, the starscape was just glorious. And I did sleep a number of nights not in my tent in order to enjoy the stars, or I would spend time before going into the tent to enjoy them. Really phenomenal, the kind of thing which, as you say, it is different. I don't know if it's so much the spiritual side or the physical side, but it's definitely very different than the starscapes that you see in California.
Thank you.
I was actually going to ask a question similar to Bar Yochai's. Listening to your inspirational journey, I was wondering if having the land of Israel beneath your feet, step after step after step, like a meditation, was an elixir, a tonic that helped you develop these wonderful tenets for living life and loving life.
Without question, I mean that's one of the main elements of the trip itself that was so uplifting for me, and I thank you for asking, because it's definitely makes it it's a very different experience than doing so, as I said, on any other trail in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question, Talia.
Yes,
Sure, Hillel.
Hillel, please.
Aryeh, first of all, thank you very much, especially for being so open about your experience and the background of it. I really enjoyed it. I'm an Israeli. I've been divorced twice, so I know kind of what you're talking about. And I was born in Israel. I grew up there. I was in the army in Sayeret and Hanim, so I know the places and all of it. And I just gave a Zoom talk 3 weeks ago also about growing up in Israel and all that. But what I wanted to ask you, so first of all, thank you. It was very interesting. If I'm not wrong, David Grossman, great Israeli author, had a similar experience after the death of his son, and he actually wrote a book about it. I believe the book is To the End of the Land, or The End of the Land of Israel, something of that nature, and that it helped him, process the difficult situation with the death of his son in the Second Lebanon War. I'm not entirely sure, but I was wondering whether that was an inspiration for that. Are you familiar with this book, with this story?
So I was not familiar with the book until I had my experience and I decided to write my book. And then I read his book in the Hebrew and then in the English. The book in Hebrew is called, now I just drew a blank. But yes, in English, it's called To the Ends of the Earth. And it's the end of the land, yeah.
Yes, the end of land.
David Grossman didn't actually hike himself in the same sense, but his book, obviously his writing for him was his mechanism, was his avenue of channeling his grief. And his book is about a woman who, it's called Isha Borachat Besorah. It's interesting, it's not, the English title isn't a direct translation, but it's about a woman who goes hiking, walking, in order to escape the news that she doesn't want to receive from the IDF, that her son has been killed in action. And yes, he did actually walk some of the sections. He's talked about that a lot in interviews about the book in order to write about the book. So the book itself was not an inspiration to me for the hike, but it was definitely inspirational in terms of the writing of my book. And I love the way that he had described some of the some of the aspects of the trail, but I didn't read it until I was almost finished writing my book, because I wasn't aware of it. But I loved it. It was a powerful, poignant, very sad, but a wonderful read. So I would definitely recommend that. And Dorit, thank you for asking about the book. I'm going to write in the comments here. You can order the book on Amazon. I can see that my father is still on our Zoom call here, so I might ask Dad if you have a couple of copies of the book, if I can ask you to send them out to people. That's also another way. I think I even have a few signed copies still at my dad's house in Marin.
Amazing.
But I'll put the information for Amazon in the and you can email me directly if you'd like.
I have one question.
Sure.
I have one question. Now, the difference of experience when you were walking in the Negev. I grew up in the Negev. So I know what you're talking about. And when you showed those photos of walking in the desert and the silence and the sound of the wind and there's nobody there, it's the experience of being completely isolated. How is the difference between walking there and working in the Galilee, for instance? Because it's totally two different terrains.
You're 100% right. It is very, very different, and yet. So it's very different in the sense that you don't really have, there were days in the Negev where you don't pass any sort of village or town or any sort of even a Bedouin encampment. Whereas in the Galil, you really can't walk for more than a few hours without coming across a road or a small kibbutz or a moshav or an Arab village or a Druze village or what have you. And obviously the vegetation is very different. There were times, there was a shot there which I didn't dwell on, but there were times I felt I was in the hills of Northern California or Switzerland. You know, fir trees and mountains and valleys and just and beautiful. In fact, I'm not going to do it now because it's I've kept you on all long enough. I think longer than maybe some of you or we might have planned. But there's a video that I didn't show of walking through one of those kind of Swiss forest parts of the Galil. But surprisingly enough, you know, when I was writing the book, I went through my journal and I discovered that I had walked out of the 48 days that I hiked. I walked for 8 weeks, as I said, but not on Shabbat. Out of those 48 days, 12 full days, I went from morning till night without seeing a single soul, completely alone. And what surprised me, Dorit, no, that's what I was saying. What surprised me, Dorit, is that only 2/3 of those were in the desert. But four of those days were up in the north, midweek, where I went literally from morning to night without seeing another soul. So even there in the Galil, which is obviously more populated, there were still days of real isolation, including that day that I mentioned, stumbling on the tomb of Elijah the prophet.
When you speak about desert and you show the photo of desert, it reminds me of Nov Kudumim. And I don't know how to translate it to English, but it's something that you don't see anywhere. You don't see anywhere.
Like a primordial. I called it a moonscape. At one point,
much better than mine. But Nov Kudumim and Hod Kudumim. I know that Hillel knows what I'm talking about because when you go in the desert, it's totally different. And when you were isolated, I know how you felt. I've been there so many times, and I know how you felt. And the quiet and the emptiness and the vastness of it is just amazing.
Yeah, it really is. And the truth is, you can get the same experience if you want to in the Mojave Desert in the Southern California, but then you're missing the historical and geographical, you know, elements that make it so meaningful to us in terms of our people and our connection. I would imagine, and I have some indigenous friends who are Native Americans, that for them to have a desert experience in their ancestral homeland is similar to what I felt and what we feel as members of the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, wandering through the desert of the land of Israel. which isn't to minimize the enjoyment that we could have hiking in Machu Picchu or in the Pacific Crest Trail or the Australian outback. Those are incredible, beautiful, wonderful, challenging, and terrific hikes to take. But my family, again, my father's here with us today, and I often talk about our family heritage. We were one of the first Jewish families to come to America. We've been in America since about 1730. And that's very unusual for American Jews, as you can all imagine. And we're very proud of that. But interestingly enough, our connection as Americans, all of us, Jews or Christians or others, all Americans are immigrants, going back to the Pilgrim Fathers. We don't have the same sense. We can't even call America as our ancestral homeland. What we call it is it's our nation, and it's our country, and we have great loyalty and patriotism, whatever our religion, whether our ethnic identity is, but it's a whole different connection to a country and loyalty to a country than the Aborigines have in Australia, than Jews have in Judea,
Most definitely. It's totally
or the
different.
Chinese have in China, for instance. Yeah.
Definitely. And we Israelis are the new nation of Israel. We're young. We're only 70 and somewhat years.
But we're
So
three and a
I would like to
half
thank you.
thousand. We're 3,500 years old as a civilization with a connection to our
Yeah.
ancestral homeland. That's the point that I'm making. Are there any
Yes.
other questions?
No. Oh, I just like to make one final comment that for those of you who have joined us, Rabbi Taff and myself for years worked on finding a way to bring Aryeh to Sacramento for a scholar in residence program. Each time we fell short of our financial goals, I was disappointed, but it was worth the wait. Aryeh, and this was a magnificent program, my kind of program, where we talk about deeper issues. And I want to say thank you for the generosity of your time. I want to encourage everybody to purchase a book. We'll definitely be getting one of those autographed copies for the library. And I have you on my wish list still, so I imagine we'll be in touch.
Well, thank you. Thank you for saying it, Natalia. It was lovely to be with you, and thank you all for joining. I appreciate the opportunity to share my story with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank you, Talia. Thank you, Rabbi Taft. And thank you, Aryeh, for being with us and honoring us with your story. And I really do appreciate that. We are the new program of Israel Cultural Desk with the KOH Library. And we all thank you so much for joining us today.
Have a wonderful week, everybody.
Thank you.